Alrighty, we're going to get going. So for those of you who weren't on when I jumped on, Alex Bartholomew, CEO of People Stretch Solutions. We're excited to have you. I have a special guest, one of our OKR coaches based out of Richmond, Virginia, Nat Pham. Nat, say hello to everyone, quick 15 seconds.
Hey everybody, Nat Pham here. Excited to be jumping into OKRs and really share with you how this framework can take you to the next level in 2021.
Awesome. Also, we can't pull off our webinars without our great producer, Truett Dill. Truett, say hello to everyone. He'll be manning the questions so we can get to everyone. Truett, say hello.
Hey everybody, look forward to making sure you all have a productive experience today.
Great. So what we try to do in our webinars is, as we go through information, if you have questions, please drop them into the chat window and we'll be monitoring along the way. There will also be about roughly 10 minutes at the end. So with a little bit of luck, we'll be able to hit a lot of content for you and get you out of here by 1:15. So as I mentioned, Alex Bartholomew, People Stretch Solutions. Our firm focuses on helping companies with OKR strategy and sales effectiveness here in the DC area. So we're working with a lot of growth companies. And certainly after surviving 2020, everyone is very focused on growth and really saying, okay, how can we help our teams become better? How can we help them become more efficient? Now let's look at how our teams felt in 2020. They were besieged by new challenges. In a lot of cases, they couldn't even get together in order to suffer together. So one of the challenges that now it's everyone is approaching working remote, hybrid, and these challenges are making these new cadences very difficult to manage. And so teams are facing some of the traditional challenges between strategy and execution. It can be a lack of alignment, a lack of accountability, maybe the priorities aren't clear, and potentially there's still too many priorities coming out of the pandemic. So for those of you who are not very familiar with OKRs, this has been around for a while. OKRs were thought to help build more efficient teams. Andy Grove, longtime CEO of Intel from the 80s and the 90s, he wasn't a fan of MBOs. And he came up with objectives and key results as his answer. And the reason is that he felt MBOs just lacked a general sense of purpose. And they didn't inspire his team. People got very tired of looking at numbers quarter over quarter. And so what he believed is that his leaders had to articulate the what, but also the why. So objectives in the OKR framework are the what and the why, and then key results are how we measure success. Now, there's an important term or set of terms that you look up there that might seem like an oxymoron: aggressive yet realistic. And the key thing there is that Andy knew that he could grow the company if he was always consistently helping his team get out of their comfort zone. So they needed to be aggressive yet realistic, because a lot of times it's very easy to set big numbers. But he also knew that if you set big numbers and you're way off, it's actually demoralizing. And so he wanted people to really be aggressive yet realistic, stretch, but attain that goal. And through OKRs, Intel certainly had a great run. But OKRs have grown in popularity, not necessarily because of what Andy Grove did at Intel, but there's another gentleman that gets a lot of credit, John Doerr. And John worked for Andy, but his career was not meant to be at Intel. He left Intel and joined Kleiner Perkins, and he went on to be one of the most successful venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. And one of his early investments, Google, was very accepting of OKRs because they had nothing else. So Sergey Brin and Larry Page were very complimentary of what OKRs did for them. And they talked about it in John Doerr's 2017 bestseller, Measure What Matters. And the important point that Doerr talks about is how OKRs are at the intersection of focus and inspiration. And so when you think about your teams and you think about what they've been through in 2020, in order to get them going and really help them become more efficient, there's this notion of how can you as a leader give them focus and inspiration, and how a framework does that. So let's look at a famous story from Google that Dor talked about in his book. Now, back in 2008, Sundar Pichai, who was a product manager then, for those of you who might recognize the name, he's now the CEO. But back then, he was a very talented product manager, and he was given the goal to build the best browser. Now, for extra credit, and this is audience participation, can anyone in the crowd guess what company was the leading browser? What was the leading browser in 2008? So this is audience participation. Drop it in chat with your answer, and we'll see who got this. So there was a 800-pound gorilla in the segment, and Google was at 0. And back then, while their ad business was very profitable, they were nowhere from a browser perspective. And so Sundar Pichai sent out some aggressive key results, and his objective was very clear: build the best browser. So across 12 consecutive quarters, he stayed focused on this, went through a lot of trials and tribulations. Each year, the key result actually went up. He raised the bar. And finally, by the end of the 3rd year, they exceeded and met their goal. They were at 111 million downloads, and that made them the most popular browser. Now, Truett, did we get any guesses for the leading browser back in 2008?
Yes, we got a couple, including Internet Explorer and Firefox from James Grady and James Ryan.
Awesome.
No Netscapes this time.
Okay, well, Internet Explorer was the correct answer. Microsoft got themselves in trouble for antitrust issues of bundling it with Windows, and that's how they occupied the top title. Thank you for submitting answers. Really appreciate your participation. So the important takeaway is that a lot of times companies wonder, okay, they want to give their best and brightest a lot of priorities. Imagine if you gave your team less priorities and you gave them a big objective. I know a lot of companies can't afford to do that, but just imagine if you focused on less, how you would help your team accomplish more. And that's the important takeaway here. You don't have to be Google in order to give your teams less to work on. What's important and can be tricky is by giving them less, can you figure out what makes it worthwhile since they're focusing on less? And so the framework, many of you might be wondering, well, how does it work? Well, OKRs is a structured goal framework, and it's meant to translate what's coming out in strategic planning and helping teams get focused so they can drive execution. And so when we look at the 3 parts, there's strategic planning. Now, many of you might only do strategic planning once a year. And so one of the things that we learned starting to implement OKRs almost 4 years ago is that most companies are doing strategic planning once a year with a very small group. And so in OKRs, a key aspect is to be able to get more people involved. And so we'll talk more about that in a little bit. The second phase of OKRs is now that you've worked out the quarterly objectives, now you go and execute. And for 10 to 11 consecutive weeks, depending on how long the strategic planning period took you, teams are focused on working very in a dogged manner of how they can move and work towards their OKRs. And leaders are choreographing the attention across team reviews and one-on-ones, and we'll talk more of that. And at the very end, they're doing a retrospective. Now, many of you, we've got a couple tech companies that have experience doing retrospectives, but we found that most companies, they might do a retrospective once a year, but OKRs demands you to do a retrospective every quarter. And so there's a huge benefit for teams when you increase the frequency, which we'll talk about. So let's dive into strategic planning. And we're going to get Nat to join us and tell some stories from the field from one of our most successful clients. But in strategic planning, one of the benefits that comes out of it is the number of conversations that happen amongst teams. So by getting more teams involved in strategic planning and driving more conversations, what surfaces to the top is what's most important. And unfortunately, some teams, some people take a little bit longer to really latch on the most mission critical items that they have to focus on. So this process, which some of you, if you're considering doing OKRs, has heard about cascading, that 2-week process has a lot of set the top level, discuss them going down, bring the feedback back up, and make sure you finalize. So Nat, one of the things I was hoping that you could share with our audience today is what kind of anecdotes have you heard as a benefit of the cascading process at the team or individual level? So give us an example at a team level, an anecdote where you had some success, or really the person you were working with where the process has really helped them.
Yeah, one of the areas where it really worked is with a guy I was working, that I'm still working with, Barry. And the key thing about it was the transparency. It's really understanding where the company vision and strategy was headed. And it took actually really to about the second quarter before it resonated. And instead of just making objectives just to make objectives based on the standard goals he was given, he understood now that the company wanted to be the most dominant player in their space. And so how does he as an individual and a leader of his team contribute to that large objective? And he realized, you know what, I don't want to be the small guy anymore who just handles these small accounts. I want to have a major account. So his objective now became a major account. And I asked, so what would be some key results behind that? That account, at least one of those accounts, needs to do $1 million a year. And I said, great. So let's focus on that. And then instead of focusing on these KPIs, he had this something that was much more inspirational and aspirational to be able to chase. And he got much more excited about what he was doing. And that's the power of OKRs, when you have that transparency, see what the leaders at the top are trying to do. And ultimately, how do you contribute to that overall objective?
And Nat, how did his team react when he set this kind of aspirational objective?
They really rallied behind him because they all felt like the redheaded stepchild. They wasn't getting as much love. They didn't get the attention and maybe the big kudos in the bigger team meetings. So now it's like, hey, we are David, and we're gonna, defeat this Goliath and become that team that's noteworthy. And I think they all rallied around that battle cry of, hey, we're going to have a major account.
That's great. And we certainly see that time and time again, because a lot of times in strategic planning, a team like that doesn't necessarily have the visibility, and they can't get their arms around making that commitment. But by being part of the conversation, it made a huge difference. Can you give us an anecdote in terms of an individual OKR and how that helped kind of a broader team? Because I know we had talked about one in particular in HR.
Well, the one I have actually isn't in HR. It's actually one that's a little bit more of a subject matter expert, Reggie. He's kind of floating out there trying to help a couple different departments. And what he wound up doing was, as we talked about it, he wanted to have different partners outside of the company that could contribute to the reach for the company. So we thought about it, says, at the end of the day, you're trying to build an efficient ecosystem, right? And to make it even more powerful, we said with lasting impact. So while he wasn't necessarily directly, under an exact department, he was trying to build an overall ecosystem that was going to benefit many departments. And that pilot, he wanted to have certain pilots in place, which was the key results. Oftentimes, folks are putting in task-related things. Oh, I have to call this person, or I got to make sure This contract's okay. All those fall in line with the key results, which is putting this major pilot in place, which is something the company's never done before, and ultimately building this really powerful objective that fits into, again, the overall objective of building an efficient ecosystem with, and here's the critical part, not just an efficient ecosystem with lasting impact, knowing that he's going to have some type of legacy, whether he stays with the customer, company short-term, mid-term, or long-term. He knows he did something that's going to have some legacy behind it, that has his name attached to it.
Yeah, and just to give context for our listeners, this is a mid-level kind of subject matter expert that kind of is shared by multiple departments and probably sits between a team OKR and individual OKR. And normally, this person wouldn't have had visibility to the top level objectives as early as he did, but because they're very inclusive and they made it very open in terms of what the top level objectives were, he was able to really get digging in and made that impact. So that's a great story, Nat. Thank you for sharing. That's wonderful. So a key part of strategic planning, those are the conversations that teams need. Oftentimes, companies think that setting a goal is just giving a piece of paper and telling someone, here's your goal. The important thing about OKRs and strategic planning, by being inclusive, it gets people having enough conversations about the right things, and that really makes a huge difference on teams. So the next stage is execution, and the two variables that really drive success in execution mode that helps teams is that focus and motivation early and often. If you're in a growth company, growth, especially in a pandemic, was really difficult. And so the companies that were able, and the leaders that were able to understand that they had to minimize the distractions. 2020 was potentially the hardest year ever to minimize the distractions that we had to go through. So how were leaders providing that much needed motivation and focus? So in the OKR framework, that's the choreography between looking at your OKRs and working on them for that 10-week period. And in that 10-week period, a leader has to choreograph that team meeting versus that one-on-one. And what am I talking about in the team meeting, and what am I talking about in the one-on-one? Now, what's very powerful about OKRs is the transparency. By looking at everyone's objectives together, the power of transparency pushes people in order to want to look good, to really work at things. Now, the unintended benefit that a lot of people don't realize is that when you operate in that much transparency, some of your best performers actually start helping others. And so by understanding, some people aren't the best at asking for help. So when you can actually see how that someone might be lagging, that's where they need the encouragement, the motivation, and a little focus, and maybe support. And that makes a huge difference on a team when everyone can pitch in and work together and support that. Now, what I'm very passionate about is this concept that we need to see our leaders being committed to master the one-on-one. And OKRs gives you a great opportunity to do that. Now, by bringing OKRs to a one-on-one, what we've seen is that we survey all of our clients after their first quarter, and we ask them about the quality of their one-on-ones and how they improved or they didn't. So 65% of our user base saw that one-on-ones improved from a conversation perspective. 40% of the base said the feedback that started flowing was more effective. And then we saw even recognition go up by 20%, or it improved 20% across our user base. So having this information and looking at it every week forces you to interact and engage. So Nat, I'd love for you to share a couple stories. One story in terms of the kind of support that a manager is getting from a leader above, tell us kind of the things that that manager has been getting in the one-on-one thanks to OKRs. It's been really helpful.
Yeah, one of the things that one of the managers was getting was a little bit of direction. Sometimes you're not sure where to go in that. So the story I have is Kara, who was given the task of putting together a onboard training, and this actually was the HR one. And so normally, you're just kind of check marking or doing what you have to do, and being able to being guided to make it something that's more passionate and more intimate. We thought through it and we talked through the chain, and it was to create a onboarding process that builds, an amazing staff and fun environment. And when you do that and you're looking at it more than just a task, again, you are a contributor and you have meaning to the company. It really changed the game on how they approached the OKR process. It's just not another process. It's just not a goal. It's not something you check off. This is something that you aspire to do, you really want to do, and not have to do.
That's great. And so that was a good example of what someone was getting. Do you have an example of a story where it helped the manager give better kind of conversation, have better conversations, give better feedback?
Yeah. The other person was Kara, and Kara had a challenging time communicating a little bit both with her team members and actually some other teams she had to take care of, and getting to the point where one of her objectives is to have a more collaborative environment that really impacted the well-being of not only her team, and they responded in kind to her and rallied around her, but also made better communications with the other team, and the process became much more efficient as far as getting information back and forth. For a while there, it was just a painful process to get information back and forth. But once there was a commitment of having that objective of open communication and collaboration, it helped her both in her department as well as cross departments.
Yeah, that's huge. In particular, for context for our listeners, it's a department that serves two other departments, kind of graphics, marketing agency, and so they have unfortunately sometimes multiple masters. And so this leader really rallied and was able to benefit by having OKRs and help that communication. So many of you are in companies where you have to have effective cross-departmental collaboration as well. And so OKRs does help as a reference point when you're collaborating. And in some cases, some companies, certainly some of our listeners today are coming from some large companies where they've developed competency to manage cross-departmental OKRs. Cross-departmental objectives are some of the most difficult things to manage in any company. And so by having tools, it really makes a huge difference in order to manage the cross-departmental initiative. So looking at that, you get through execution and then you find yourself in the retrospective. And so what we found at People Stretch, we do a lot of coaching outside of just OKRs. And so from a performance perspective, it's important that teams can nurture a sense of accomplishment and also learn on a consistent basis. And so in a retrospective, a lot of companies sometimes only focus on the bad or maybe only focus on the good. And this has to be balanced because it allows everyone to learn in terms of, it's great that we won, but why did we win? What aspects did we win? And if we lost, let's learn from some of those difficulties so that way everyone can move forward. And I think a lot of times our CEO clients out there talk about, hey, we want to establish a stretch culture. We want people pushing themselves. But there's a very important cultural question that everyone, certainly on this call, should ask themselves is have you created an environment so that people feel comfortable that they can fail? And a lot of companies are not there. They have not created that environment where people can fail. And so because of that, people are not taking chances. They're not really putting themselves out there, either by setting higher objectives and or in the retrospective, really talking about what they experienced or didn't experience. And so a lot of times, what kind of questions do you want to ask to help the team? And I think, certainly early on as a company implements objectives and key results, asking, was the right team intent captured and direction for the quarter? Some of our listeners are today on the webinar have some very rapidly changing industries where you might have to pivot. And so oftentimes a pivot can blow up your best laid plans. And in OKRs, you know what? That's okay. As long as we all intentionally made the decision to go in a different direction, it gave us an opportunity to really be able to learn and what do we need to do the next quarter. A lot of times, and this goes to the next question, did we have the right key results? For team performance and building efficient teams, you always have to be looking at, it's not just a question of setting the bar high enough, but what happens if you set the bar low enough? It's easy for a company, if they do this multiple quarters, to allow complacency to set in. So that's a big thing that we really try to drive. And then at the higher level, when we look at, week over week, were we accomplishing where we needed to be? And then ultimately, were there any external dynamics? And how is this going to kind of affect our next quarter? So we encourage that, a retrospective ends a quarter, but is the gateway to the next. And this concept of having also, you can already start having some of those conversations needed to get the team ready for the next quarter. So Nat, I was curious to get a final anecdote from you in terms of how retrospectives has helped one of the individuals that you've worked with.
Yeah, it makes me recall of one of the folks, Eli, and Eli was getting into the third quarter, an extremely busy third quarter, and had, oftentimes as you cascade down, you don't want any more three. I really wanted him to maybe focused on two, but he was ambitious, and that's great. Had 3 OKRs, and he hit one of them in a major way because that was really his job responsibility, to hit these objectives for his or these goals and mile markers for his clients or his accounts. And the thing he did though was he was trying to hit these what they call push goals for every single client. And while he hit them for a lot of them, I think he would have been better served to say, hey, let's do 3 of the 5 because it was such a busy time, right? And he got those. And then he wanted a third, Eli wanted a third one where he wanted to get certified in something on top of it, which was his third objective. And he just didn't even touch that at all. And a lot of it is because of the organizational focus on getting this busy time focus on their clients, because that's what mattered most. And oftentimes we get so excited to get so many objectives done, we don't realize what's in front of us. And so the retrospective, the following quarter, he reeled back certain things and then applied the right objectives for both, not only for himself, but what does the overall organization want. So he had to rethink that. And again, that thing that you said before, that's also realistic, right? Ambitious, aggressive, but realistically, really think through your day, week, month, and quarter of how you're going to fit this in. And that's what he learned. He got some wins, and we celebrated that major win because he crushed some objectives there for his accounts and clients.
That's great. And so that's an example kind of at the mid-level. A great example that we're helping the client now is that they in 2020 actually were able to grow 20% over the previous year in spite of the pandemic. But in spite of growing, in the retrospective at the end of December, what surfaced is they had the way they were organized and going to market from a service delivery perspective. In spite of the growth, they were still falling short in terms of where they wanted to be. And through a retrospective at the team level and then a retrospective at the top level, they actually came to the conclusion that they have to reorganize in 2021 if they want to continue to scale from where they are to another 50% increase over the next 3 years. And so that reorganization was germinated, and the idea really took shape in the retrospective because they took an honest look that while revenue had grown, they actually saw profitability dip in a lot of their projects, and they were running into a number of other challenges from a team, lack of communication. And so they didn't want to get lost in the celebration of the revenue growth. They took a long look at the mirror and they came up with a great business outcome, which now they're working to implement over the next 6 months. So oftentimes a retrospective can mean a great win for an individual, but it can also mean that an organization is mature enough and to look at itself that in spite of a lot of things going right, recognize some of the things that will impede its future growth. So I think you've gotten a chance to kind of review with us today how OKRs builds more efficient teams, but let's kind of make sure that we drive it home. So teams need that focus and inspiration. We find that OKRs, the 3 phases, the structured framework, it's incredibly effective at getting alignment and accountability and really giving teams what they need in each of those phases. We found that OKRs build winning teams, and ultimately that weekly check-in, weekly one-on-one is a huge opportunity for you to add value in your organization. So we've reached the time for Q&A. Nat, I know that one of the things now that we've almost gotten through planning for 2021, is there any, while we wait for questions from our audience, this is where our audience asks questions about what we covered in the presentation, any trend that you see with our client in terms of what they're seeing?
I think the biggest trend with our clients is starting to push the envelope a little bit in their objectives and understanding the difference between key results that is task oriented or KPIs oriented versus outcome oriented. Really understanding, hey, what is, at the end of the day, what do you want to happen versus, hey, I'm just looking for a number, a sales number. What is, at the end of the day, you know, to have a major client, for instance, versus, hey, I want to hit $1 million, which is more of a KPI than it is a key result, understanding that piece. And then really, I have one who's starting to really push more as far as the aggressiveness because they understand, you know what, it's okay to fail. They've seen certain people not fail everything, but if you hit 100% all the time, it's not aggressive enough. It's not challenging enough. So
Sure.
They're starting to get more excited about pushing the envelope. So I think that's the biggest trend because they're starting to feel comfortable.
There's momentum. There's momentum. So we have a question from the group, and the question is, how about OKRs in the staff meeting, or should they only be in one-on-one? They should actually be in both. And we encourage clients, depending on the size of the entity, you definitely want to have it in a leadership team meeting. You might want to consider it even at all hands. I mean, there's a time and a place. The important thing is is what information do you look at in that kind of leadership team review versus maybe a team meeting, staff meeting within a department. The differences are all about in how you break it up. So we have a follow-up question. How do you do OKRs when you have different departments with disparate functions? So that great question. So one of the biggest reasons why when I learned about OKRs almost 5 years ago is because there wasn't an easy way for disparate functions to get together and try to agree on, hey, we're going to enter a structured framework. So the disparate function, the OKRs aren't about finding a common objective and key result that applies to everyone. Hopefully, at a top level, a CEO can lay out the vision of the 3 big top objectives, okay? And then each department is going to contribute in their own way to some or all of the top objectives. So what legal does will be different than what publishing will be different for the research. And so the terminology is when you have a top level objective, you then do a contributing objective. And so I was just on a call before this webinar explaining, in the world of OKRs, there's a lot of thought about how to set these multi-level objectives. And so I'm a fan of setting objectives to objectives. And so when you have, I've worked with a lot of chief counsels, a lot of their objectives are sometimes around managing risk. Some legal counsel's objectives, just if, for example, might be about if they do a lot of legal review for contracts and documents. So setting it for them at their level is actually part of what I think is the magic of OKRs, which is it's easy to set top level goals for an organization, for a president. What's not easy, and this is why it takes a couple of weeks, at least from a strategic planning, is working through how are you going to define success for each of those departments. So I think you've got this great opportunity in order to set the goals or objectives at the department level. Next question, are these annual goals and what are top level objectives? Great question. So the introducing terms, every organization, depending on when you start objectives, so there's a timing, but let's say you started in December. And so, most companies have annual goals. You would have your top level objectives, and that objective is meant to articulate what you're trying to accomplish and how you will measure that. A lot of times with goals is that even when you try to write SMART goals, people articulate something and oftentimes it's lacking a why, or it's very clear on the what, but how you can't get everyone to agree on measure it because people just didn't think about that. Some people do, but most organizations struggle sometimes with trying to measure some of the goals or objectives that they set. So in OKRs, you set 3 at the top, on an annual basis, but if you start outside of an annual cycle, you just set them at a quarter at a time. And we find that a lot of our maybe fast growth companies like setting objectives a quarter at a time because it really puts a lot of attention on velocity and getting things done now. The biggest challenge that organizations have experienced when they've plateaued and maybe look for OKRs to support them is that there's not enough urgency to focus on what's needed now. And OKRs forces you, and that was giving an anecdote of people who've been doing OKRs for roughly 3 quarters. So they're starting to get the hang of how to focus on what matters now and to set the bar at the right level. So what's important is that if you haven't read much on OKRs, it's a goal framework that's predicated on setting top level objectives and then breaking it down to the next level and the next level. Hopefully, James Grady, I answered your question. If you have a follow-up, please let me know. Any other questions from the group before I share a couple of trends and we'll wrap up? So as I'm sharing final trends that I'm seeing, going into 2021, more and more people knew that they have to grow, that they have to do things to get their business going again. There were certainly some winners in the pandemic, but there were a lot of people who were happy to be net neutral. Now, I think all of us hopefully are optimistic about our prospects of exiting the pandemic, hopefully at the end of this year, and being able to be back in a pre-pandemic environment in 2022. And so with that, it's important that from a business modality that we're starting to think, how do we consider doing some different things? So we're seeing companies say we need to get better at accountability because in the pandemic, accountability slipped. We need to get better at alignment. Through the pandemic, the management cadence changed, it suffered, and we've got to tighten up. So as you start thinking about what do I need to do, what does my team need to do for 2021, we've hit the things that I think most leadership teams have the bullseye on, is how do I get my teams aligned and accountable to restart growth for 2021 and or accelerate growth from where they were before. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We will be sending out a copy of the webinar. If you'd like to reach out and have a follow-up with more questions, we are more than happy to jump on a 30-minute OKR consultation in order to answer your questions if potentially we didn't get to you, or maybe you have some additional follow-up questions. So I hope everyone has a great Thursday. Thank you today. Nat, thank you for joining me, and Truett, thank you for producing us another great program. Have a great Thursday, everyone. Take care.